We work a lot with governments, and just like we would advise our corporate clients not to focus on short-term profits, we thought it would be important to, when we talk with our government clients, that they think about what long-term sustainable development is. So rather than thinking solely as GDP being the most important thing to grow in their country, it's how do you translate that GDP or that GDP growth into the overall sustainable benefits for the population.
The leaders we work with, so we work with presidents in 6 African countries, and I suppose the broad story is that of progress, right? So 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world last year were in Africa, but for that progress to be sustainable, which is the word that we kind of latch onto in the report, it needs to be converted into progress that everyday people see. So reductions in poverty, improvements in healthcare, roads getting built. So how do you turn that success that people are starting to notice economically into social progress or development?
Let's take Brazil as an example. Brazil actually has the best score in improving well-being for its population. And you look at what it's done. A couple of things it's done. One is it's done much better than other countries in improving its environment, especially compared to the rest of the BRIC countries. Another thing that it did is it really focused on improving income equality. Latin America traditionally has, if you compare to other developing regions, has the lowest income equality. But Brazil has taken a lot of very specific steps to improve income equality, particularly around encouraging lower income families to send their children to school, to get their children immunized, and some of the subsidies that they get are based on achieving certain milestones.
And just to follow up on that, I think particularly in the kinds of countries we work in, so post-conflict countries or fragile states such as Liberia or Sierra Leone, there's a couple of things that really leapt out for me in Doug's report. So firstly, this issue of governance, I think it's worth unpicking 2 sides to governance. I think there's the accountability side, democracy, freedom of speech, tackling corruption and so on. And then there's the state effectiveness side. Has the government actually got the capacity to deliver results, healthcare programs and so on? And particularly in emerging countries, just to take Liberia, I think the 2 really go hand in hand. So when someone like President Sirleaf was elected, it's the first democratic election since the war, there's great optimism and hope. So the accountability is working and there are expectations placed on the leader, but then she needs to be able to actually respond to that with the other side of governance, deliver some results that people can see, and that builds the legitimacy of the state and confidence in the institutions. And the other aspect that's a real issue at the moment for countries we work with is how you handle resources. So Liberia's has found substantial oil reserves, same for Sierra Leone. We also work in South Sudan, where obviously the oil issue has been a huge part of the challenges for the country. And a lot of the debate on oil and natural resources focused on how do you get it out of the ground, how do you stop corruption, how do you deal with the kind of Dutch disease, the economic consequences. But there's also a load of big decisions for the leaders to take, and how do you use those resources in the right way? Should you be focusing on infrastructure, building roads? Should you be focusing on education and healthcare? These are really big transformational decisions that will determine the trajectory of these countries, and having as much evidence as possible for the leaders to think those things through feels just really important at the moment.
Let's keep in mind that there are things that can be done to improve the well-being of a population that doesn't require additional money. And as much as can be done related to changing policy, related to liberalizing certain aspects of the way a country runs itself. Ethiopia is actually one of the countries that is the strongest in translating the improvements in their wealth into improvements in well-being of any country in the world. And one of the things that they've greatly improved on in the last few years is healthcare, and also outcomes of healthcare. And I think coming back to the basics is really important. They set a few clear targets. They focused on what was right. They focused on preventative healthcare. So rather than being reactionary to a particular disease, it's about getting into the communities, hiring community healthcare workers to go out, explain that access to clean water will prevent diseases, usage of mosquito nets, uses of condoms, all are things that will prevent the need for greater health care in the future, and they've been very, very successful at doing that. Whether you're in the top 15 countries of the world or you're in the bottom 15 countries of the world, I think the lessons that you can learn and the information you can get by SETA or by other tools that provide this information, I think can be very, very helpful without having any, let's say, particular policies that are right or wrong, or any particular development theories that are right or wrong or applicable.
And for the Africa Governance Initiative, our work is very much about supporting a government to deliver their own priorities. So it's not about, we think you should focus on healthcare versus infrastructure versus attracting investment. It's, given the priorities you yourselves have chosen, what could you put in place to increase the chances that they happen, that they get implemented? And there is some best practice, and we've drawn on our experience both from outside Africa and from the different countries we work in, some lessons about how best to do that. But actually it can look very different depending on the specific country you're working in. So, for example, one of the things we've observed is that in order to drive a reform through, you need to make sure that political authority is used effectively to keep things on track. So some of that's about measuring how things are going and being able to tell, are enough hospitals being built towards our plan? But some of it's about making sure that the president and the minister gets that information and can use it effectively. And so in somewhere like Sierra Leone, what that looks like is performance contracts between the president and his minister, and every so often the minister has to come and report to the president and say, this is going well, I'm having a bit of a challenge here, can you help with it? So the authorities applied. The same issue looks totally different in Rwanda. They've set up a joint delivery committee because they have a different constitution and a different structure. So they bring the Prime Minister, the President's office, the Finance Minister all together and do it through a sort of committee system. So it's the same principle, but it looks completely different. And increasingly, the countries we work with are sharing their experiences amongst each other. So the government of Sierra Leone recently went on a visit to the government of Rwanda to share experiences on capacity building. And they'll do it in a different way, but some of the principles and the learning, I think, does apply across the countries.
You mentioned governance in Africa, and that's very important. And I had talked about governance with the top 15 countries in the rest of the world. But what's also really interesting is that 10 of the top 40 countries in improving well-being are actually in Africa, right? Which might be surprising to many, countries like Ethiopia and countries like Rwanda. And if you look at why they are doing that, if you look at across the 10 dimensions of the top countries in Africa versus the rest of Africa, it's governance and improvements in governance that has been driving that overall improvement in sustainable economic development scores.
As an international community, we need to take some responsibility for our impact on governance, particularly in post-fragile countries, post-conflict countries, because one of the big things that I take from this kind of analysis and other analysis of which countries have developed, not just in Africa but broadly, is that there isn't a single path to development. There are different routes, different countries and different regions have adopted different strategies. And what I think flows from that is that as a donor or as an outside agent trying to help a country, the best thing you can do is back it to deliver the priorities it itself has chosen. And if we look at things like the Paris Agenda and we look at ourselves harshly, we haven't really, as an international community, lived up to those promises of country ownership and supporting domestic processes. So I do think it can be a distraction from the government's own development planning and prioritisation. And in terms of how you choose the priorities, I mean, you definitely want a government that has the right advice and the right systems, but I think there's a real danger of countries adopting what look like the right policies in order to meet external criteria rather than genuinely driving their own reforms. And I think when you see real change is when it's something that a country has genuinely chosen and the leadership are driving through and they've built a system to make it happen. So just to take an example from our work, free healthcare in Sierra Leone has been on the agenda in discussions with development partners and the government of Sierra Leone for years, if not decades. But it actually happened when President Koroma made a big, bold political announcement that free healthcare for mothers and young children would be in place by the 50th anniversary of independence. So it's a huge symbolic political decision. And then he built a system to drive that through. The donors supported it, of course, and provided resources and expertise, but really it was a domestically driven decision that delivered that huge change.
I think it's important that the donor community and the recipient countries just have a very strong dialogue between them, right? And if SEDA and other tools like that can help provide a fact base to have that dialogue, so that there's measurable and tangible improvements, that you can use it to help, let's say, identify what the greatest needs are within a country. But in a sense, it also can be used to help identify which countries have what's in place to be able to receive aid money and use it in the optimal way.
We really see that in situations of relatively weak or new institutions and scarce resources, the way that you can really get things done is to make pretty hard choices, to prioritise quite ruthlessly on the 2 or 3 areas that the leadership are going to focus on. And I do worry sometimes that the process by which the development partners and governments interact doesn't help with prioritisation. If we look at a lot of poverty reduction strategies, which are the product of that discussion, they'll often have a kind of 100, 150 indicators because people use them to insert their particular issue.
Right.
And that's kind of fine because there are obviously a lot of important things to do, but if you really want to change and you really want to prioritise, you need something that sits above that and says, out of these 100 issues that are all important, what are the 3 that we're really going to focus on and really get done?
If a government leader in Africa needs to look at Norway and what they're doing, it's not necessarily going to be very, very relevant. But if they can look at what the country next door is doing, because that country has a similar culture, similar set of resources, similar set of problems, it can be much more relevant to them, and it can create a program that's much more implementable for them. So yes, I actually think that's a very good way of looking at it.
Yeah, I'd probably go a bit further actually and say not just will the South look more to the South for its lessons, but I think the North will look increasingly to the South and elsewhere. I think a lot of innovation happens in the most extreme circumstances, so where scarce resources force you to come up with new ideas. And I think increasingly in areas like education or healthcare, the North can look to the South. The South has the advantage of not having to go through all the kind of steps of public service development that have happened in more developed countries. And I think increasingly the Prime Minister of the UK or the President of the United States should be looking to a Brazil or a Nigeria or an Indonesia for a particular insight on a particular issue.